Have you ever seen a group of herders on the move, maybe with their sheep or goats, and just wondered, where are they all going? Well, for millions of people all over the world, this life in motion, it isn't just a trip, it's everything. These are pastoral nomads, and their lives are an absolute masterclass in adaptation and survival. So let's dive into this incredible story, this intricate dance between people, their animals, and the land itself.
When we see a sight like this, hundreds of sheep grazing across a huge mountain meadow, it's so easy to think of it as just aimless wandering. But really, it's the exact opposite of that. For pastoralists, this movement is a brilliant and strategic system. It's been perfected over centuries to make a living from some of the world's toughest environments.
And that right there is the big question we're tackling today. Because the story of pastoral nomads in the modern world is really a story of a massive collision, a clash between this fluid, cyclical way of life and a newer world that's just obsessed with straight lines, private property, and keeping everyone in one place.
Okay, so before we get into that collision, we first have to appreciate the absolute genius of this system. This is not random wandering, not at all. It's this incredibly sophisticated dance with the seasons, with the snow, and with the rain.
So in a place like India, this really breaks down into two main patterns. On one hand, you've got your mountain pastoralists, like the Gaudy shepherds. Their life is a vertical cycle. They spend the winter in the low hills, and then in April, they march upwards, literally following the melting snow to get to these high-altitude summer meadows. Then on the other hand, you have groups like the Dongars on the plateaus. Their cycle is horizontal, driven by the monsoon. They move from dry areas to wet coastal regions, timing their arrival perfectly with the harvest.
And this slide, wow, it shows those two extremes perfectly, doesn't it? On the left, you've got the lush, high-altitude mountain pastures of the Himalayas. They're called bughyals. And on the right, the dry, arid desert of Rajasthan. They're two completely different worlds, but the same core principles of movement, timing, and adaptation allow these communities to thrive in both.
And they're not just moving through an empty landscape either. No, they are a key part of this complex social and economic web. Just look at the Dongar shepherds and the Konkani farmers. So when the Dongars arrive in the Konkan region, their flocks get to graze on all the leftover stubble from the harvest. In return, their animals manure the fields, fertilizing them for the next crop. It's a perfect symbiotic relationship. It's a total win-win that's worked for generations.
But this carefully balanced world was completely turned upside down with the arrival of colonial rule. All of a sudden, these new ideas about land, about ownership, and productivity were forced on them, and these new ideas saw absolutely no value in a life of constant motion. This is where the collision really begins.
You see, the colonial state had one main goal: revenue. And to them, any land that wasn't being farmed was wasteland, unproductive. So they just took over huge grazing grounds. Then the Forest Acts came along. Forests that pastoralists had used for centuries were now declared reserved for timber. Suddenly, invisible lines became hard walls. Their movement, the very basis of their survival, was now controlled by permits that told them exactly when they could enter an area and for how long.
But it wasn't just about land. It was really about control. Colonial officials were deeply suspicious of mobile people. I mean, think about it. They were hard to track, hard to tax, and hard to rule. This suspicion actually got written into law with things like the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871, which basically branded entire communities as criminal from birth. And then, on top of all that, a grazing tax was brought in, charging pastoralists for the right to feed their animals on pastures that were shrinking by the day. And here's the thing. This was not an isolated incident. This pattern of fencing off land and restricting movement was a hallmark of colonial rule everywhere. To see just how devastating this was, we can look to Africa and to the story of the Maasai.
Right, so we're going to focus in on the Maasai, who are cattle herders living in Kenya and Tanzania. Their story is just a powerful case study of how these global changes played out on the ground, with absolutely devastating consequences for a very proud and resilient people.
60%. Just let that number sink in. That's how much of their pre-colonial lands the Maasai lost. Back in 1885, a line was just drawn on a map, cutting Maasai land in half between British Kenya and what was then German Tanganyika. And of course, the best grazing lands were then taken for white settlement. Just try to imagine losing over half of your world.
So what happened to all that lost land? Well, some of the richest pastures on Earth were turned into famous game reserves, like the Serengeti National Park.
The Maasai were pushed into these dry, arid zones, and then forbidden from ever entering the very lands their ancestors had grazed for generations. This confinement to poor-quality land made them incredibly vulnerable to drought.
This quote from herders in Namibia, it just captures the feeling perfectly. It's not just about losing land. It's about losing freedom. We are in jail. Just that feeling of being boxed in, of having your entire world, which was built on fluidity and motion, suddenly caged by invisible lines.
But this is not just a story of loss. If it were, pastoralists would have vanished a century ago. This final section is about something even more powerful, their incredible capacity to adapt and endure in a world that literally tried to make them obsolete.
So how in the world do they survive? Well, they adapted. When one route was closed, they found another. The Raikas of Rajasthan, for instance, they forged completely new routes into Haryana after partition closed their old path to Sindh. They reduced their herd sizes, they diversified into trade and wage labor, and crucially, they began to organize politically to demand their rights.
This comparison really says it all. On the left, you've got a traditional scene of gaudy shepherds shearing their sheep. And on the right, Raika herders navigating a modern highway, sharing the road with massive trucks. The world has changed dramatically, but that fundamental life of herding and movement continues, adapting to whatever new challenges come along.
And this is maybe the most important takeaway from all of this. The idea that pastoralism is some ancient, outdated practice is just plain wrong. They are not historical artifacts. They are a vital part of our world right now, today.
In fact, modern ecologists are increasingly realizing that in many of the world's most fragile environments, dry lands, mountains, pastoral nomadism isn't just a way of life, it's the most ecologically sustainable way of life. This rotational grazing prevents any single patch of land from being destroyed, and it allows everything to recover and thrive. It's like modern science is finally catching up to ancient wisdom.
So, we'll end with this question. In a world that's facing climate change and resource scarcity, what can we learn from a culture that's built on mobility, on adaptation, and on a deep, symbiotic relationship with the environment? The story of the pastoral nomad is not over. In fact, it might just hold some crucial lessons for our own future.